what do we mean when we say something is structural? Like an injustice is structural. What is that structural? Well, like Mike Davis can really concretely show you what it looks like to think structurally. He's going to piece together things you guys mentioned, right? Like aspects of like the way that neighborhoods are zoned, the way that City Hall functions, what the relationship between different neighborhoods have, what the, you know, how the built environment of the city is being affected and transformed by global flows of capital and all that. And very specifically, none of those things are abstract. You said like, it's from these like Japanese firms to like these buildings in downtown LA, you know? So, yeah. I just think both of you guys like touched on, actually, I think a really helpful place to start.
Yeah, it's like nothing is abstract in his writing. You know, like he will sometimes, and that was one of the things that was interesting about the essay on Marx that we read, because he wants to make, I think, the same case about Marx. And I like what you said, Owen, about how that description of what's going on in the class struggles in France, 1848 to 50, and then the 18th Brumaire, that like there aren't abstractions in Marx there, right? He's talking in very concrete terms about disparate actors and agents that are sort of in transitional like kind of formation and their conflicts amongst each other. He's not talking about, you know, there's the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, right? Like that is that is such a like an abstract level of analysis that it's just actually foreign to how Marx talks when he talks in the political writings, right? He's like not saying that shit at all. He's saying like, okay, these finance creditors had this or that, like, you know, relationship with like the political forces aligned only provisionally with like the petty bourgeoisie of the countryside. We're talking very specific, very detailed, granular analyses. And I think that's what Mike Davis does too.
Yeah.
he never just talks about like the capitalist class. That's foreign to his entire way of thinking. And I guess maybe like as a first pass, like, you know, if he models for us what it means to be a materialist thinker or to do materialist historiography or to do a materialist like history of labor or of urban architecture, like you have to be this specific. You know, you can't speak at the level of abstraction.
So let me ask you guys what you think about this abstraction thing. Because on the one hand, I quite agree that like the way that what makes the writing special is like somebody who is clearly armed with the social theory and enough knowledge to do historical and political analysis, you know? But like, I guess I don't know what I think about these claims about abstraction. Like, I don't think abstraction is always a problem. And I don't think he'd be able to do what he does if he wasn't equipped with a certain set of useful abstractions. And like, sometimes maybe I'm just kind of leading us to my like pet peeve of the way that people kind of talk about, you know, a text like Capital, where the objection is always like, this is an ideal type, it's in the air, and it's really just representing a certain kind of capitalism at a certain time, and at some point that has to come down to earth. Like to me, this set of arguments is kind of like, in the first place, just misplaced. Like, there is a role for abstraction. You use abstractions to illuminate things, and there's no way of like getting around the fact that abstractions are going to make some things salient and not others. Every theorist is going to make a choice. So there's this like demand in philosophical or theoretical thinking to like make things concrete, always the local, always the practical. But I just don't really, like, I think the potency of an analysis like Davis's is because he's presupposing the abstractions that are needed to illuminate more concrete phenomena. And so in that sense, it's not like doing something different. It's like a different kind of, it's a research program that's making good on a set of abstractions. Like, the reason you can tell if their abstractions are useful and right is because they allow you to do this. So then when people are like, oh, but Marx doesn't talk about, you know, the gig economy. It's like, well, that's not his fault. Why don't you think about the good gig economy? You know, like, why don't you?
Marx, he should have lived longer, I guess.
But there's like this kind of way of being like, what about? And it's like, but that's your failure to understand the system logic. That's not Marx's problem. Like, you have not understood, and therefore you can't approach history or the world in a way that gives you a picture of a totality because you're constantly like doing whataboutism.
Yeah, I think that's a good point about the abstraction being presupposed there. And in fact, we probably just take it for granted. But the minute analyses would just be like, I don't know, mundane cataloging, right? If it didn't have that abstract framework. I also love just the way that he uses capital as a reference and how he wishes there was capital for all these other different things, or he identifies different things as the capital. So he says at one point in his preface to another awesome book about cities, it's called The Pig and the Skyscraper. It's about Chicago. In the preface to that book, he says that like Chicago history as it's delineated, like its labor history and its class history as it's delineated in that book, is like capital in the streets. Like Chicago history is capital real as like a real tangible set of phenomena that, you know, occurred. And then he also says at one point that he wishes Marx had written a capital or at least a Grundrisse of materialist political theory. So yeah, I think the point about the abstract, like I think that it's capital is the abstract framework of capital is, I think, what animates the whole thing, what gives it form, all of these very specific social analyses.
And also building on that, the reason why he is able to talk about, you know, briefly in the other thing that you sent us, you know, Chicago, so concretely and so insightfully, but also, you know, LA, is, well, I think about it this way. We talk about LA as if it's this, you know, this single thing, but, you know, if you were just cataloging it, these are just, you know, disparate, you know, agents, disparate neighborhoods that, you know, are bounded by nothing more than we use a name in order to say all this collection of stuff belongs to LA. What he shows is, you know, what he brings to relief, and this, you know, is the work of abstraction, are these, you know, these social relations of not only interdependency but interference that you can't see just by looking at, you know, the disparate objects that make up whatever it is that we call LA. And so what he does to us is it is actually a very concrete new abstraction that he renders before us, where we no longer see LA in the same way. LA is now all of these, you know, social relations, and we use that language of social relations, structures, and someone's like, so what are you talking about? But what he does here is he shows it's not simply about return to the concrete, but it's also not about, you know, ideal type abstraction. It's about finding the abstract in the concrete, and, you know, rendering the concrete sensible, you know, in a particular determinate manner. And I think, you know, that's kind of, you know, what I you know, not to be like too glowing about, but that's like kind of the genius of his writing, that the specificity is, it isn't simply I'm reporting back to you what I'm seeing on the streets, as if like also what Marx was doing, like the 18th Brumaire, he was just simply telling you, oh, here's what, you know, this historical event looks like. It actually brings into relief these abstract relations that aren't necessarily perceivable to the empirical eye, but they're also not simply just made up in his mind. And so it gives you a broader sense of what it means to talk about something like LA, talk about something like Chicago.
Yeah, not just as like a heap, but as a dynamic totality, if I can use that language, the Hegelian language of the absolute.
Okay. Jillian Rose has entered the chat.
Well, this is like the thing, right? Like, yeah, clearly that's not what Marx is doing either. And like, this is great because it actually, I think, helps explain the difficulty I have telling someone what Mike Davis was, right? Like, you know, sometimes I'm like, he's a labor historian, and like, that's true. But there's also so much more going on here, and I think this is why his writing, and also I would say there's a couple of like contemporary authors who are like this. I feel the same way about a lot of Naomi Klein's work, where it's like, this is like explosive, electric, like journalistic writing, which of course Marx also did, right? The Neue Rheinische Zeitung, like, you know, he did journalism for a long time. A lot of the work is like actually telling you what things look like, but in a totally like theoretically sophisticated way with a view of the whole.